late Rhema Bible Church founder, Pastor Ray McCauley, will be remembered at a memorial service in Randburg this evening. This is one of two events planned to honor his life. The second service will be held next Thursday. McCauley died on Tuesday evening at the age of 75, surrounded by family. At the time of his death, he's handed over the reins to his sons, Pastor Joshua McCauley, and this was due to ill health. McCauley's funeral will take place next week, Saturday. My colleague Thabo Mdluli is watching developments in Randburg this evening. Thabo, good evening to you, and let's look back at the life and times of Pastor Ray McCauley, one of the people that he ministered with, Pastor Geert Khoza, quoted in the News 24 platform this afternoon, saying that Pastor McCauley died a man who was deeply hurt by the poverty that is widespread in South Africa 30 years into democracy, and needless to say, corruption also overrunning the public sphere. What else can we say about Pastor Ray McCauley in his last few days?
Well, evening, Chloe. I mean, as you put it, it is a part of the hallmark that defined who he was. His heart to see justice, his heart to see the areas of our society that have not been thoroughly being addressed. And of course, as a pioneer of what is called inclusive church, was able to go into some of the impoverished areas and be able to spread the message of love and the message of the gospel and be able to hit those areas with the word. But somebody who has a similar passion and who by parallels, you could say, has decided to do exactly the same and cross over into dealing directly with the injustices that are happening in society is Mmusi Maimane, who will understand exactly what it means to wear the garment, right, of the pastorate, but be able to then put that not aside, but wear it in society, in politics, and particularly addressing some of the ills in society.
Yeah, and I think that you take inspiration from people like Pastor Ray in even simple terms like in '94, when it looked like the elections weren't going to proceed, etc. Hear him and people like Archbishop Tutu acted as midwives to our transitions in some ways. And so our inspiration we draw from today, from a life like that, is to say, how do we ourselves take on that role of pursuing justice, pursuing a sense of equality, and not see a separation that says my spirituality stops at the door of a church, but ultimately it moves into society and say, how do we keep our integrity, serve the most vulnerable, and ultimately go into society to bring about a transition. So this is a life well lived, and all we can do is seek to emulate and take the journey of South Africa and its transition to the next level. And so I think we've lost not only a giant, but a genuine role model, a citizen who was not perfect, but sought to do what was best for our nation. And so today we mourn as collectively, not only as Christians, but I think as South Africans, there's an incredible role that Pastor Ray played in our society.
You might not have had the build-up of the question that my colleague asked, Chloe, but he was referring to an article by Pastor Geert Khoza earlier on around the burden now that was on Pastor Ray around corruption and around poverty in our society. What do you think is the call, I suppose, in support and in pushing ahead the legacy of Pastor Ray McCauley, is the call for the church today?
No, absolutely. I think any society that undergoes its transition can only stabilize on the basis of values, and part of those values are ethical leadership. The last lunch I had with Pastor Ray, he challenged, he said, look here, we've got to instill ethics in Parliament, in the leaders we elect. Part of fighting corruption, at some level we have to police, at some level we have to investigate, but you can't police and investigate all acts of corruption, because it speaks to the citizen who decides to bribe a cop on the side of the road. It speaks to the small acts that happen. We've got to bring society back to its values. And I think ultimately the challenge that we've got to face up to is ourselves as leaders to be ethical in our leadership, in the way we work, but more than anything, to say to ourselves, the threshold or the standards of Parliament require us to lead, to elect leaders who are ethical, who will set new standards, who will be able to say, look, just because there are no cameras around, just because there are no police around, I've still got to live a life that is worthy of the office I've been called to. And so I think in continuation of that, that's part of the work. And then ultimately, to fight hard and say the institutions must fight. I know Pastor Ray fought hard against even issues of state capture. He challenged us a lot. I remember his delegation of a multi-faith delegation when he came to Parliament to challenge us as leaders to say, you set an examples for society. And he was very harsh and criticizing Parliament, but I will remember those because we take those lessons forward to say, let's build institutions that are strong, fight against corruption, and build ethical leadership going forward.
And in that context of multi-faith and multifacetedness of our society, we are now in a government of national unity. I opened by saying he's known and hailed as a pioneer of inclusive church. But when you look today at the demographic of Rhema Bible Church, it speaks of inclusivity, but it speaks of inclusivity that recognizes what you've always said, who is the majority in the country.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Martin Luther King lamented this term. He said sometimes the most segregated hour in the US is Sunday morning, because sometimes we can as a society build institutions, churches, places of worship where black South Africans go one way, white South Africans go one way. Rhema Church pioneered a sense of which even throughout apartheid to say the God we serve is a God of all South Africans, black, white, Indian and color. Pastor Ray was emblematic not only of inclusion as far as diversity is concerned, but was able to reach across and meet an imam, the rabbi, all across, because he recognized that ultimately our expression of faith is to not only build inclusion, but to serve the most vulnerable. So to me, the legacy of what this church represents, which today is so diverse, not only in income, in race, but also in political persuasions, tells me about the fact that there can be spaces in South Africa where we can see that South Africa that works for all, where we can together say, whilst we worship the same God, let us serve citizens regardless of where they come from. And that genuinely is an effort that we've got to continue and say, how do we serve the most vulnerable in our society further on, as our own gospel compels us to do, to say, may the least of these, when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? And I think that's a legacy of Pastor Ray, and certainly something I take forward at a personal level, at an organizational level, and certainly would want to see happen more in society.
We're confident it is time, and we allow you to go in and be a part of the service. Mmusi Maimane, they're reflecting on the legacy of Pastor Ray McCauley. As reflected already, this is the first of two services that will precede the funeral service, which will be held next week. And what you are really going to be hearing today is largely messages geared towards the family, towards the church, to comfort them. It's called a comfort service. So some words from Scripture that are going to be directed at those individuals who are gathered here already for the start of that service. Back to you, Xoli.